do you determine? I want to pick out a piece there. How do you determine a good versus a bad commercial?
All right, this is the $1 million question because there's so many moving parts with commercial. Like you've got like who the tenant is, the location, foot traffic, road traffic, supply, demand, vacancy rates, occupancy rates, fit out costs.
What's the key factor? What do you reckon?
Key factor for me is low vacancy rates. I don't want to buy a client or myself a property that's going to sit there vacant for long periods of time. It's a good indicator that the property's in demand. So if you look in an area and the properties are getting, I don't know, say like Brisbane, and like vacancy rates about 0.6% at the moment, and I'll show you some round the ground stuff later. That's generally like 1 to 3 months vacancy. So if you're on average getting your tenant, say 7 to 12 years, having a couple months vacancy is not that different to having a resi. You lose a tenant for a week every couple of years. So that's the main one. Then watching out that the future supply is not going to outstrip it. So don't buy like on the edge of a city where they're going to build 200 warehouses, for instance, and then you're going to have an oversupply in the market. So buy like something surrounded by residential, that population's growing. They're not going to have less of a demand for car mechanics, wholesalers, distributors, fabricators, storage in 10 years' time when there's more people there. So if the same amount of stock's there, least demand will be there. I'll never promise capital growth, but I'll kind of promise demand. I'll say, look, here's the data to show that this property will be in more demand, and then the market will do its thing. Like there's always something. There's always I don't know, Royal Commission, APRA lending restrictions, pandemic, removal of negative gearing, war in Ukraine, supply chain issues, etc., etc. But the actual stats behind it are still really strong. So if you're making a decision based on a 10-year decision, not a 2-week, 1-week decision, the fundamentals are there. And to be honest, you should be planning for high interest rates. Like even when I was sending clients properties 5 years ago, my cash flow spreadsheet table went from 2% up to 10% anyway, just so we could see what happens over that time. 30 average is around what, 6-7%. So you should actually be doing your calculations off those anyway.
Would you say that if the economy in Australia starts to look a little shaky, which at the moment is still looking pretty good, like unemployment at 40-year lows or 50-year lows, whatever it is. If that starts to take a bit of a turn, do you sort of see lenders, particularly the lease stock, starting to get a little? Is there a less appetite, or like what can happen in that situation? Have you sort of seen that?
Exactly the same as residential. They're going to make sure they make money no matter what the way they can. So that's either through increasing interest rates, which we've seen they've had $1 billion returns, or pulling back on the loan to value ratios to mitigate the risk that way. So that's normal. But like I keep saying, like I don't pretend to be an economist. Like it's just numbers for me. I look at that long term and I plan for the worst and hope for the best. So like that's how you should be looking at property. But you can just see here, let's go 80% loan, or let's go 70% because you do need to put a bigger deposit in. 70% loan, $1 million, you're going to get $65,000 of rent. And one of the advantages of commercial, as I've mentioned before, is the tenant pays the outgoings. So they pay all these kind of insurances, rates, council rates, water rates, maintenance. So you don't really have any outgoings. The only real outgoing you're going to have is rental management. Like I said, it's going to be $2-3 grand a year-ish. And then the interest that you have on the debt. So let's say 70% loan, $1 million property, you've got 65 grand rent coming into your bank account, 28 grand going out for interest, bit of rental management, and that's it. So we're 34 grand a year positive on that property on a 70%, 4%. That's a low interest rate. So don't think you're going to get that now. But just comparing that with $70 on a residential, if I can survive, if I get a good bank guarantee and a good rental bond, and I say, get 3 years out of the tenant before they leave, I'm actually $100,000 up. Like that gives me a really good buffer to be able to weather some vacancy storm. Like if the tenant leaves, I've got 100 grand to pay 28 grand a year. So I can survive actually 3.5 years or just over 3 years before I actually have to start dipping into my pocket. And that's part of commercial as well, guys. Like you need to plan your buffers. If you've got a tenant leaving, depending on what you're buying and the vacancy rates and things like that, have that 6, 12, 24-month buffer sitting there so you can mitigate that risk. But that is a bit of a light bulb moment for me. When people say, oh, commercial's riskier, it is when you don't have a tenant. But when you do have a tenant, you can set up some really cool buffers just with the property itself. But
Yeah.
let's go to the other end of the spectrum. So 10% at 80% loan. So resi was 47 grand a year negative in cash flow. But if we got 6%, probably we're 12 grand a year positive. Commercial, 80% loan, we are only 17 grand negative per year while we've got the tenant. And then if we get the 6% capital growth, we're 42 grand a year positive in the green versus the $2,000. So we're actually getting a better return. So as you can see, the numbers are more attractive with commercial, but you have to get the asset class right. And I don't want to sugarcoat it for anyone kind of watching. It's all about buying the right one. You can burn yourself a lot more with commercial if you don't know what you're doing. So by that, let's just say this year, let's go 80% loan, 65 grand. You lose that tenant for a year, your 80 grand interest repayments you need to pay out of your pocket, and you're 20 grand negative versus 47 grand negative and 12 grand positive after capital gains. So it's riskier when you don't have a tenant, but while you do have a tenant, it's obviously quite attractive. Like for me, I can handle 17 grand a year. If I lose a tenant for a year, I can handle that even at 10%. And then this is where having more commercial properties can actually arguably be a lower risk strategy, because if you've got 4 or 5 tenants and the leases are all ending at different periods, even if you say lose one tenant, you're still cash flow positive and you can look after it that way.
Commercial property depreciation. What is it? What is it we need to know? And yeah, what are the key sort of things to consider?
You know what I really liked about this is not going to be a Steve Palise love in, by the way. I'm about to throw him some shade. I love that he put like depreciation as 0 on a commercial property, because it's so variable. And if I was worried that he was going to say, what sort of deductions, Mike? And I'd have to go, oh, Steve, like we've got to talk about when was it built? Has there been any prior improvements? Has the new owner put a mezzanine floor in this warehouse? All that sort of stuff. I think the most important thing to understand is that depreciation is a bonus. It's not a strategy. Those numbers can look better or worse once you plug in those figures, absolutely. But I think that's probably the most important thing to say. Now, if I'm going to throw shade at Steve, I saw a video pop up of him the other day and I thought, oh, there he is with his beard and he does great things with a chair and a glass. But then he starts talking about tax depreciation. I thought, Jesus, stay in your lane, will you? It's all I've got to talk about. And he's cutting my grass. So, like, he's quiet now for the moment. So I'll take the floor. Of course, it depends on the type of property that you have. I mean, what residential and commercial have in common is there's two main buckets of depreciation. There's the plant and equipment items, Division 40. There's the structural components, the hard assets, the concrete, the timber, Division 43. Now, what's distinctly different with commercial is that the legislation changes that happened in the budget speech in 2017 don't apply. So the short story to that is that second-hand plant and equipment items will give you depreciation deductions in commercial, but they won't in resi. You could have a 6-month-old property, buy that and get 0 plant and equipment deductions. It's really unfair. With commercial, it's not the case. We'll work out whatever the residual value is and you'll be able to claim it from there on in. The other thing to note is that the ATO effective life tax legislation, which comes out normally a week or so into July each year. The current one is TR 2022/1, if you want to look it up. It has about 281 pages. And now about 4.5 of that relates to residential property. The rest of it is commercial. So such a huge list of plant and equipment items for commercial property. And every year they're adding new things. So wood and upholstery manufacturing is a new category. Casino operators is a new category this year. So it's nice to know Mr. Pack is going to get some extra deductions. So there's just so much complexity to commercial tax depreciation. But what I think you should know is that the cutoff date for original claims on the building structure is different depending on the asset, whether it's manufacturing or whether it's a warehouse, whether it's travel or accommodation. There's different rates and things. But probably a good date to remember is 1982. That'll cover most bases. So if it's built after
3 years earlier.
Yeah. So if it's built after 1982, there's probably going to be some original building claim. But then if it's built prior to 1982, it begs the question, well, how is it functioning as an income-producing property? Like a warehouse could be built in the 60s and left untouched, and there could be zero depreciation on it, right? But you are going to see upgrades in fire services. So a warehouse will often have, might have dock levelers. It could have ventilation fans. If there's an office component, it's going to have carpets and partitioning and blinds and security systems and things like that. But when it comes to commercial, the best deductions are obviously in newer properties, but properties that have the most stuff inside them. So a warehouse is not as good for depreciation as, say, a pub, because per square meter, there are more widgets in a pub than there are a commercial property. I know that's terribly scientific and people can't keep up, but we'll try and keep it. We'll try and keep it at that level.
So we're buying a pub, are we, Palise? Which pub are we buying?
No, do not buy a pub. Lenders hate them, and they're very hard to make profitable. And yeah, just stay away from pubs in general unless you know what you're doing. They're a niche in themselves. One point, Mike, that you mentioned, like the good thing with commercial is if you're a tenant of a commercial, you still get to claim the depreciation. So you can be operating your business there and claiming all the building and stuff as well as the business, which is quite important.
Yeah, so when we go and we do a depreciation schedule, we're often doing more than one at the same property. Now, it could be for someone that has an interest in both companies. So it could be their self-managed super fund that owns the business. That's a relatively common thing to happen in commercial. And then their business actually trades out of the premises, and that business may have done a fit out. So they can claim all of the fit out expenses, and they might have, tables and chairs and reception desks and even computers and photocopiers and, even things scientific like autoclaves. You can get really crazy with it. But the self-managed super fund might just own the building structure and, say, the fixed plant and equipment like the security system. So yeah, absolutely. Whether you are buying, say, a leasehold entity, like you could buy a leasehold motel or a freehold motel, there's depreciation for both entities.
There you go.
What I really like, Mike, you use the word, and people forget this. People think depreciation is part of your cash flow. Like you said, it's a bonus. You're getting it. And I hate to tell people, you're getting it because the property actually is depreciating. Like if you've got a residential property and you depreciate the structure, in 50 years' time, that building is not worth the same. You've actually lost money. You have to build another one. You have to fork out money. It's supposed to be a fair one. You can obviously flim-flam the system to try to get some good returns, but it's because you're actually losing money. That's why you're claiming it back off your income.
Yes, and really every widget, whether it be a brick or, let's say, a de-stemmer in a winery, has an effective life given by the tax office. Now, we're more commonly used to seeing plant and equipment effective lives. Let's say carpet in a drinking area of a pub is 5 years, in a dining area it's 7 because people spill less shit. But the building structure itself will have a 40-year effective life as well. So that's basically the tax office saying that by the end of that period, the building will have reached its functional obsolescence. It sort of needs to be replaced. Now, it could still have a market value. So a property that's 50 years old as a warehouse is not going to be worth nothing. But from a depreciation point of view, it has zero depreciable value.
One of the things I find is every Sydney person, we've seen this with residential as well, wants to buy Wollongong, Central Coast, Newcastle, Sydney, because they think that's the best location and they can go drive and look at the property. But I hate to tell them the warehouse they look at doesn't care that they've seen it or not. It has nothing to do with the numbers. It's just a bit of self-assurance. Same thing as the Melbourne people always bring up Geelong and those areas and Bendigo and stuff like that. So, but first hotspot, Jeff, that I really like, bought a couple in Brookvale on the northern beaches, and these numbers back it up. There's some really cool stuff there. Again, there's a waiting list and the main reason for that is there's a lack of supply because you've got the ocean on one side and it's completely filled in. The closer you go, the closer you get to the city, so it becomes more densely populated. Some really good demand in that kind of Brookvale area where that services a huge region of the northern beaches as well. And there's a lot of local kind of service-based businesses, the builders, fabricators. People love being there because of the lifestyle. And just in terms of money as well, most people there have done really well with property and incomes. So there's still kind of a good wealth barrier there where they can keep building new stock and things like that. So Northern Beaches, you can actually, if you buy well, you can get to 5% in front of the number. I bought a couple at 5.2, 5.4% in the last year. So really like that as an area. Brisbane and Perth depends on kind of if you're looking for more high yields. So let's just go to Brisbane. Up in the north, so kind of Moreton Bay regions and areas like that, you'll kind of get that 6 to 6.5%. So really like the Rothwells and Callingers and areas like that. If you're chasing yield, if you go closer in the city, you're probably getting closer to 5.6, 5.8%. But again, industrial stock there's quite nice. And then Perth, if you're really chasing yields like that Dulux one I showed you, like Rockingham's really good. Sites like Wangara, there's another really good site. And they'll give you comfort in the numbers there. So for industrial, that's where I'll pick. So retail, to give you your hotspots, Jeff, I like the areas where we're seeing really big population growth and there's a lack of supply. So this is where I'll probably go even more regional. I've got no issues with buying in the Tamworths and the Coffs Harbours and the Margaret Rivers and the areas like that, assuming you're buying something where there's a lack of supply. So if you get on the main street and they're building out around that, they're not going to build another main street. So you've kind of captured that. If you go to like Sunshine Coast and you buy like on Mooloolaba beachfront, that you've got the scarcity factor because they can't build it out. You're always going to be on the beachfront. You're always going to have the cafes and the board shorts and bikini shops and all that type of stuff. That gives you the kind of comfort there. But again, do your due diligence. But for me, sometimes retail in regional areas is lower risk than a capital city. Like as we saw in capital cities, if the city goes really quiet, you don't get the foot traffic anymore. But in a lifestyle area, they always have the foot traffic, assuming there's not kind of like a pandemic. And that's where another risk comes. If they stop getting tourism, like Cairns and Port Douglas, that saw a decline, obviously during COVID when the borders shut and they weren't getting the big portion of international tourists coming over for the Great Barrier Reef. So you just got to be mindful of the market you're in. If it's seasonal as well, is it a summer location? Is it a winter skiing location like a Jindabyne or something like that? But I really like retail in regional towns because it can offer a lower risk than kind of buying capital cities.
So what amount is a good starting point? This is the age old, like you think 300,000 and you say, Steve, or 3 or 4, but I don't
it depends. It depends what you're trying to achieve with the purchase. If it's just you want to buy a little cheap property just for a little bit of cash flow, you can get a nice little warehouse in a Brisbane or Perth for 300K. The negative with it is you're not going to get like a 5-year lease. It's going to be a sole trader who just works on his car or leaves like, I don't know, this has a little bit of distribution business from there. They're only going to sign 12 and 24-month leases. They're also going to be more volatile because most small businesses go one or two ways. They either outgrow the space and they move on, or they close up shop. So you're going to go through a new tenant on those every like 3 to 5 years, but they're a nice little way to get into the market. The proper question should be, is waiting to get a 500 grand one a better property, which you will start getting the 2, 3, 4 year leases with those. The answer is yes, if you can do it quickly. So if you can save up for a year or two, then get into a slightly better quality asset, then yes. If it's just to get into the market and kind of dabble your toe, learn the ropes, then you can still buy cheap. Anything less than that's fraught with risk. You're going really regional, or you're going like a retail or an office, but just buying a little warehouse somewhere is not a bad option.
Do you buy much in Penrith, Steve? Because somebody said 600. Like, what sort of price points typically? I mean, I don't know if you buy that much.
Penrith is not a bad spot. It's just the bang for buck. Out there, you're probably only getting 80 to 150 square meter warehouse. So a little bit more one-dimensional. Whereas if you go like a Brisbane, spend 600K, you can get a 250 to 400 square meter warehouse. But yeah, Penrith's actually a good spot. I actually personally own some property in the Blue Mountains, and that's using a lot of the warehouses in Penrith because that doesn't have its own quite big industrial estates.